So welcome to the Climate Teacher Ed webinar hosted by the Institute of Science and Math Education at the University of Washington in Seattle. I am Dr. Deb Elmorson, a research scientist at the Institute and a climate justice learning designer and advisor. I'll be co-moderating the discussion today along with my colleague, Dr. Philip Bell, a professor in the College of Education.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for making time to join us at this busy time of the year with everything academic and school related wrapping up or headed towards wrapping up. This webinar series is an activity of a new effort called the Climate Teacher Ed Collaborative. The Collaborative is a teacher education initiative dedicated to helping future teachers learn how to engage youth in community climate justice projects and in civic participation in response to the climate crisis. In this monthly webinar series, we're talking with experts who can help us think about how to do that work in teacher ed and how to build our resources and capacity to support that work.
We hope the webinar series today will be a valuable resource for teacher educators and educators in general to focus instruction on just responses to the climate crisis. We encourage you to check out the professional learning resources we are sharing through the climate learning section of the stemteachingtools.org website. For those of you joining us live today, please post questions in the for the presenter in the question and answer function in Zoom. Today, I'm joining from the unceded ancestral and current homelands and territories of the Wasanich people of Sadeas, Pender Island in British Columbia, Canada.
Yeah, and the University of Washington in Seattle, where I work, and where I live. It operates on the lands of the Lushootseed speaking peoples, the Coast Salish peoples who identify as the Duwamish, Muckleshoot, Suquamish, Naqualumi, Tulalip, and Puyallup peoples. We are immensely grateful for their stewardship since time immemorial and in ongoing ways around these lands and waters. And as we engage in this climate-related work, I want to hold their sovereignty and focus as we think about the efforts that we initiate and participate in. This certainly includes matters of educational sovereignty for the purposes of tribal thriving and kind of continuance of their lifeways in ways that are desirable to them. So ask you to kind of hold that commitment to think through what actions and material supports might be part of moving that forward.
And there are some resources that we provided in the slides, which we will link to our final site to help with those types of understandings and growing knowledges. All right. So
we're just thrilled to have Tim Swinehart with us today. So thank you so much. And I think, Deb, you're going to do a quick introduction of Tim so everyone gets to learn a bit about him before we hand things over.
Yes, absolutely. So Tim teaches geography and environmental justice at Lincoln High School and instructs teacher candidates at the Lewis and Clark Graduate School of Education in Portland, Oregon. He received the 2015 Oregon Outstanding Social Studies Teacher of the Year Award and is co-editor of A People's Curriculum for the Earth, teaching about climate change and the environmental crisis. And he's also currently involved in revising this resource, which I'm really excited to see the revision. He's a founding member of the Portland Public Schools Climate Justice Committee. Tim's social studies classes at Lincoln have worked with various community organizations over the years to successfully advocate for environmental and climate justice policies at the local and state level. And his work as an environmental justice educator has been featured in the New York Times, Yes Magazine, and the NEA Today.
Our colleagues are sharing related resources in the chat if you'd want to follow up. All of those resources will be bundled together in the show notes for the recording. So if they scroll by now, you'll get to them later, perhaps. Tim, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you both. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk and to reflect a bit on my experiences as a teacher and what I've learned really from the relationships that I've had with students and other teachers over the years. So yeah, I really appreciate it. Let me go ahead and get my screen shared here.
Yeah. So we had kind of asked you to think about a few things stepping into this hour. First one is really just about kind of how you define community climate justice education work, and open that a bit up for us, and we'll find our way into a conversation. So we'll hand it back to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. So I also wanted to start with a land acknowledgement appropriate to Portland, and this is written by some of my students earlier in the year after the assignment that we did to work on that. So this is compliments of Lark, Redding, Sophia, and Dylan. We acknowledge that we are presently occupying the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Willamette and Columbia rivers. By this occupation, we recognize we are actively benefiting from the erasure and oppression of Indigenous peoples. Due to the Kalapuya Treaty of 1855, Western Oregon Termination Act, Klamath Termination Act, 1954, as well as settler-brought disease, Indigenous people have repeatedly, forcibly been removed from their homes and lands which we now live on. While enduring the lasting effects of colonization, the Indigenous community in Oregon has stayed resilient. Through cultural restoration and traditional practices, Indigenous culture has survived for thousands of years. In Portland alone, we have the 9th largest Native population with 380 tribes represented and are home to over 20 Native-led organizations. We recognize that Indigenous people are the past, present, and future of this land. Do not make reading this acknowledgement a performative act. We encourage you to continue educating yourself and fighting for justice for the Indigenous peoples of Oregon.
All right. So maybe I think you'll just segue, I think, into opening up some broad framing for us. Is that fair?
Yeah, sorry, my screen was doing exactly what I knew it was going to do, which was not wanting to advance, but
you did it. Nice.
Okay. So yeah, some of these resources I know will be shared as we move on in the conversation. But probably the most noteworthy thing there is the picture of my daughters, who are one of part of the inspiration for why I do the work that I do. Well, so, I appreciate the question, framing climate justice education. It's simple, but with the word community in front of it, I think it's key, really, actually, to, what I want to say today as a social studies educator and the way that I've approached climate justice education. Which is really, to this first bullet point, to really approach it as a collective enterprise. I think that there's been too much of a focus in many ways. In terms of environmental education for a long time, it's what I encountered, it's what so many of my students encountered, that we teach about the environmental crisis, and ultimately we end up pointing students towards individual solutions to this crisis. And I think there's, in some ways, I want to make an argument today that we really have to be intentionally moving away from that. And I know that lands differently with people, but I do kind of want to underscore that as part of the argument I'm making. So, so I really think that our pedagogy or curriculum has to be, moving towards activism that is collective. No surprise as a social studies teacher that, I'm making an argument in favor of multidisciplinary climate justice education. And I'll give some examples to help hopefully underscore this. But we need, and when I say the arts, I do mean history, social studies, language arts, but I also literally mean art. And there are, again, some ways that I have just seen my own students' participation in art as a form of climate education and activism that has just really sort of brought me around to the value of that in our practice. I think, as climate justice education, we always absolutely have to be centering and rooting our practice in the stories of BIPOC frontline communities who, are not only the communities that have been, most marginalized, most affected, having done the least. But, I think even more importantly are the communities that are leading the way towards a different future, towards a regenerative economy, towards a more just future. And I think that those stories and how we share them are just absolutely crucial, again, to our practice. And finally, something I hope that I can shine through, and something I'm always trying to push myself a little bit more towards, because this is hard work and this is a big, overwhelming topic to teach about, is that, we also want our classes, our pedagogy, our curriculum to really mirror a world that we want to live in, one that is joyful, one where hope is not hard to come by, where we are responsive to one another's needs, and also just where love is part of what we do together every day. And that's something like I said, I struggle with, to remind myself to make that a part of my practice in the class every day. But I do think I think that's really important too. Okay,
Yeah.
I'll pause there for a second.
No, it's all good. I really appreciate that. And so I think you've named a number of really important edges for us to hold on to. And I think at the top of the webinar, we failed to invite our participants in the audience to generate questions and comments for us. So if you want to do that in the chat or through the Q&A functionality of Zoom, we would love that. I kind of am really drawn to kind of this edge that's been coming up a lot, where I think you have a lot to speak to around activism and collective empowerment and what that looks like from the classroom teacher practice perspective. So I hope we can really kind of open up that edge in the coming bit. Deb, I'm going to hand it to you, I think, maybe to take us next, perhaps.
Yeah, so as we're thinking about the shifts that we do want educators to make, I think this is this edge of like understanding activism, advocacy, action-centered learning. And as you have them taking up this type of approach, we know that we have worked with a number of our colleagues on this over the years. What guidance would you share with these educators as they enter into this kind of work for the first time?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. So I guess I wanted to focus on a couple of broad brushstrokes, I guess. And the first one is to talk a little bit about what this can look like curricularly, and the efforts that I have been involved with. And again, just to emphasize that there is nothing worth a darn or meaningful that I have done on my own over the last 18 years of teaching. It has always been in community and collaboration with other teachers, and with my students, who I'm always learning from. And so I really want to emphasize that from the beginning. And also just to underscore the important nature of collaborative work, which we're not always given enough space for as K-12 educators, but that, just the importance of pushing for that. So yeah, one I think is through the curriculum, and then in a moment I'll get to kind of what that has looked like for practice in practice for me with my environmental justice class. But even if we're not able to get our students out into the community, if we're not able to do some of the things that I've had the chance to do, I think that we can always bring these social movements and collective action to the classroom. And so that's what we tried to do when we put together People's Curriculum for the Earth. Doing that work probably 10 years ago, and that we're really trying to even emphasize more as we put together a second edition of it. So there's a couple of examples here of activities, role plays that were originally published in the book. Whether that is highlighting the global small farmer movement, Livy Campesina, which I just taught this role play a few weeks ago in my geography classes, and I still think it has some of the most like imaginative, hopeful solutions and stories to the climate crisis and related issues, that we can bring, and students continue to be moved by it. Also, the role play on the 2009 Anchorage meeting of Indigenous peoples from around the world at the Indigenous Peoples Global Summit on Climate Change. both examples of trying to bring those stories of activism to the classroom, and to try to help students kind of like try on that perspective. Couple other examples of curriculum written since the book was published that are available at the Zen Education Project, a resource that I really want to make sure people know about, especially the Teach Climate Justice campaign at Zen Ed. So the Blockadia roleplay, which really kind of highlights, and this is something that I did a few months ago in my environmental justice class, but really looking at how people are working together in the anti-fossil fuel movement, and again, like something that I would emphasize is that I have made an effort over the last few years to not just teach about fossil fuels, but to really teach against fossil fuels, because that, again, feels like the only sort of way that I can teach in line with, with a world that can support life in the future. And then one more example is the Climate Justice Activist Mixer, which I wanted to just talk even just a tiny bit more about here. My colleague Matt Reed and I, when we wrote this just a few years ago, we were really inspired actually by our students. We felt called to action when our students were leading climate strikes. And so we felt like we needed to do more to try to bring voices of activists from all across the country into our classroom, and to be able to share that with colleagues. This is actually a lesson that a lot of colleagues I know used for students that were not able to go out and join climate strikes, but on the day of climate strikes, this was something that a lot of people used in school to, again, kind of bring that action to schools. So like, and again, in terms of the multidisciplinary approach to how we teach about these issues, I think that importantly, that comes up in activism as well, right? So just a few examples here are an artist in New York, a farmer and organizer, Doria Robinson, just amazing activists in Richmond, California, a youth activist, Vic Barrett, who's part of the Our Children's Trust national lawsuit, and then Henry Red Cloud, Lakota community solar activists, are just a few of the 20 some stories that are part of this. And I think maybe some workshops that I've given, we've had a chance to kind of look at these and to try this on. And since we don't have the opportunity to do that today, I would just maybe share that I know that science teachers, for example, have used this pretty successfully in opening units about the climate crisis. And so I know that it's been used in a lot of different scenarios. So yeah, so curriculum would be one way that, one thing that I would share to, to start kind of, what I've learned, I guess, and what I would share. And then the other piece would be the activist piece.
Tim, can I ask about the curriculum piece for a second?
Yeah, totally.
Because I really think like one of the things that's hard to pull off, which I see you working so hard to pull off and doing it well, is to make that a collaborative venture with so many different voices and perspectives and histories that get brought into focus.
Right.
And I just kind of wanted to stop and pause and like, because often curriculum gets designed by others far away elsewhere, and then it's kind of on educators to adapt if they have time and capacity and resources to adapt. And so like, I just wanted to like surface that particular strategy, which I see you using to like really sink in as a group locally.
Yeah, I mean, and I really appreciate you, Phil, pointing that out. And I think it's absolutely crucial. I mean, it's the only way teachers working in collaboration, with other teachers, and being like having the space and time to do that, it's really the only way that we're able to create curriculum that we feel like is entirely responsible to, or responsive to, our students, to the particular communities that we teach in. And so it really, and I know that you know, that y'all in Washington have really highlighted this in your work, but you know, our approach to climate justice education has to empower teachers within sort of the local spaces and communities that they're in to do that. You know, the top-down model of curriculum development that has become, unfortunately, such a norm, I think, in school districts, you know, through 20 years of education reform and standardization. It's not gonna cut it here. And so, yeah, I really appreciate you pointing that out.
Yeah, appreciate that. And yeah, so let's sink into the activism piece. I didn't mean to stop it.
Yeah. So yeah, we'll you all asked me to share like one or two examples, and I thought I'd preface this by saying, you know, I have quite a few examples here, and we'll kind of get to what we have time to get to, but it is broadly all, you know, examples that come from the one example of my environmental justice class. But, you know, I mean, essentially here, these are just lessons I've learned from my students. And in some ways you know, this is just sort of a proud and humbled teacher sharing some of what I've learned over the last 6 years of teaching this class. So when we passed the Portland Public Schools Climate Justice Resolution in 2016, which there's kind of a whole nother story around that, and I would urge folks to find some of the writing that Bill Bigelow, my colleague and mentor, has done around that community process to bring that to the school board and have that pass as one of the first climate justice policies in the country. It really opened up the opportunity for a lot of teachers and students to kind of think differently. And so, you know, for me, what that meant is that I had a group of students that one day during a meeting that I had gone to talk to them about, they said, "Hey, you know, Mr. Swinehart, can we have an environmental activism class at Lincoln?" And it was the end of lunch, and I was about to go back to my class that I was going to teach, and I just kept walking to the principal's office, and who fortunately has always been very supportive, and said, "Hey, students want to know if we can have an environmental activism class," and so it was born out of their question. Really, you know, under this premise, right? And this is kind of a joke, right? Because Scott Morrison in Australia was, you know, saying we want more learning in schools and less activism, right? But, you know, really under this notion that activism is learning, and I feel like I have had a chance to see that over the last few years in a variety of ways. So, you know, one, I guess, that I want to emphasize here is to stay open in the communities that we're in to collaboration with community organizations. So much of what we've had a chance to do has been in partnership and collaboration with various organizations here in Portland. So whether it was early on with 350 PDX, getting students down to City Hall to offer testimony in favor of the fossil fuel infrastructure ban. And just a note in terms of that one point about you know, joyful you know, pedagogy, that I do have my guitar there on the picture on the left, and we're singing the mayor a song. You know, and like that's just like one example of you know, where that can show up. Another example, Neighbors for Clean Air. And they had this idea, let's deliver clean air Valentines in favor of clean air legislation, trying to get, Oregon actually has some of the most laggard diesel particulate regulations on the whole West Coast. And so advocating to improve that. And so, yeah, just some really wonderful opportunities there. One that I thought it would be worth taking just a couple minutes to share here, because it still moves me to tears every time, is Julia, when we were at the Capitol, had the poem that she had written for her semester final on environmental justice ready to go. You know, and I guess one of the lessons here is that if you kind of plant the seeds in class, you know, with assignments, you never know when those might grow and sprout, you know, in the community. And so this was her guerrilla reading to her poetry reading to Governor Brown in 2018. I'll just make sure that the
of Hurricane Katrina and says we need
hopefully
to
the sound
wake
is
up.
okay.
Because Hurricanes Harvey and Irma are in far too many headlines to ignore. Because there's flooding in Texas, Florida, Long Island, Puerto Rico. Because in Houston, water drips from broken ceilings like tears. Because in Syria, the only water is the tears streaming down refugees' faces as they are forced to leave their home, the result of a drought-induced civil war. Because Hurricane Katrina was over 10 years ago, and people are still forced to choose whether to rebuild or retreat, because I am reminded that choice is a privilege. Naomi Klein states the scientific facts of climate change allow one to choose how they will react, and many still insist on blatantly disregarding these facts. In 2017, Trump states that climate change research is a waste of money. Trump, I urge you to tell that to Mika Mayava, who wakes up every morning to realize the shoreline of the island he calls home is consistently receding. Tell that to Feifei, a young girl in Beijing who can't leave her house without a pollution mask. Tell that to Danielle, who lives in fear of the Pacific Connector pipeline destroying the river that runs near her home, the river that is her everything. Because we need to wake up. The US pulls out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Wake up. Media commentators speak of compassion fatigue. Since when does compassion have a limit? Wake up. An anti-environmental politician pounds his fist on a table. It shakes. The whole world shakes. Wake up. Because we won't rest until ash ceases to swirl in the sky like raindrops, until the only water rushing is glistening through streams, waterfalls, rivers, oceans, until we shift from caring about paychecks to caring about people. Until we can see empathy, dripping like honey, swinging from trees, spreading like ice in the Arctic, until we can lay on the earth and let compassion encircle us like a blanket of blue sky.
Wow. That's fabulous. Can we get a copy?
Yeah,
Can we get a copy?
Take
That'd
this
be
one
great.
if you want. Yeah.
Thank you. So
Yeah, so I've always liked sharing that. That was clearly a very special moment to be there as a teacher. But yeah, I think, you know, like I said, there were a lot of pieces that came together in that moment, you know, and I think it was just a lesson for me that if you kind of like help to plant those seeds along the way, you know, things like that can happen. So I have, I know I'm a little short on, I got too many examples and a little short on time here. So I think what I'm going to do actually is just, I'm going to kind of skip to this year because I want to talk a little bit about this year. This was the last thing prior to the pandemic that I was able to do with students, which was just incredible. It was kind of a collaboration with Sunrise PDX, planning and climate strike in December 2019. Our classroom kind of turned into an organizing hub. You know, the foundation had been laid. And then I just kind of got out of the way. And I just, you know, let students do what they are so capable of doing. And it was really extraordinary. And then the pandemic hit. And, you know, youth climate activism imploded, right, in a lot of ways. And I, you know, and I think it's been interesting this year to come back and to feel like we're having to reorient ourselves, that, you know, we're carrying this, you know, this trauma of the pandemic with us. And we're, you know, I've noticed the way in which students sort of, they need help sort of learning how to reorganize, how to, you know, find their way back into community, back into collaboration with one another. And so I think there've been some important lessons that I just wanted to share briefly from this year too. You know, so like, it was really tremendous to have a climate strike in the fall, to organize around a little bit. It was a real shot in the arm for everybody. again, in terms of joy, beauty, we got to take a field trip to my brother-in-law's farm in Washington State, in fact. And, I heard from students, it was a good reminder afterwards. They said just like how healing, in fact, it was to just walk the land a little bit, and to be out in that space. And I was really moved by how many of them showed up like at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning. Good reminder, good lesson there. And then we did, excuse me, did a field trip that I've done over the last few years with other educators, with teacher ed classes at Lewis and Clark. But it's to Portland's fossil fuel sacrifice zone, which is where it's the critical energy infrastructure hub, where there are all of these fossil fuel tanks. And so we went there with the Braided River campaign to hear the stories of the communities that have been displaced over the years by this sacrifice zone, and then also, what activists are doing to confront it today. And this was so important for students to get out, and it was a lot of work to like figure out the field trip, and school districts not really supporting it in the same way. And so, but we made it work, and we got out, and really the benefit was that just these last couple of weeks, it blossomed into this really wonderful art show for Earth Week that my class organized and put up in the halls of Lincoln High School. And just as a small example, this little sculpture kind of up front, it's the Willamette, it's kind of hard to tell, but it's like repurposed trash that the student who's kind of struggled to participate over the course of the year, but through art, found a way to kind of express what he was caring about, and made this incredible sculpture that hundreds, of students at Lincoln were able to see, and then the panels kind of explaining the history of the Willamette River across the back. Couple of other examples, if we have time later on, to displaying some Imagining 2040 work from class and People of Hope. And then finally culminating in this presentation that students from my class have organized to give to other freshman classes at Lincoln, as well as some teacher ed candidates at PSU just last Thursday. And, and I think the final piece that I would say here is, in terms of activism, teachers are going to have different opportunities in different places to engage students in activism. But one of the things that I like to think about are how we all exist within school communities that are really kind of ripe with potential for education campaigns, for raising awareness. And that's a form of activism, so when students are able to educate other students and adults, because actually sometimes the adults are just as important within their own school buildings, within their communities, they're engaging in activism. And in fact, that's been some of the most meaningful activism I've watched my students have a chance to participate in over the years. And so just kind of wanted to, pause here with that as something to share.
That's great. Thank you for the examples. It's great to see this kind of work with students. You've talked a bit about the joyful and critical pedagogy that you're using as an approach. And it seems like collaboration and different forms of action are involved in the work that you're doing. These are always challenges for educators that aren't familiar on how to do this. Can you provide some guidance for educators on how to engage youth in learning about climate education like this?
Actually, we just got a question that builds on that, one more layer. So let me add this piece, because someone in the audience says, well, these efforts are great, but I hear many voices recently that would not agree. What's your response in terms of societal and educational value for these student learning activities to those who would say it's not appropriate for public school education to take up this focus? So kind of how do people find their way in, and how do they navigate maybe that complexity?
Right, sure. Well, maybe we'll start with let's start with how to find our way in, and then try to get to the second question sort of through that. I think in terms of finding your way in, there's just a few examples of assignments that I have come back to year after year that I think can really help in to draw students in to the work, and to, you know, to help, again, to kind of build the community in your classroom, that this sort of thing can, you know, these lessons, these topics can really sort of, you know, blossom within. And so, you know, one thing is just making this personal, right? It's like, you know, that's always, I think, probably one of the most important things we can do. And so, you know, in my geography classes, that's been starting every year with a story of place narrative, you know, and then circling up and spending the first few days, first, sometimes, you know, even a week and a half of class, in a circle sharing these. And, you know, and that's valuable time, but it's time that I just find to be really well spent. And so that, you know, that kind of thing is something that we come back to over the course of the year. In environmental justice, it's writing something called an environmental autobiography. But again, it's a narrative, it's a personal story, you know, and it's just like, it's one, valuing our students where they're at, and finding ways for those narratives to make their way into class, and then ultimately to connect to, you know, the content that we want to bring as teachers. You know, but knowing, again, that like the content doesn't matter as much to them if they're not personally invested, right? You know, something like this too, students will often say afterwards, like, gosh, I thought I was the only one that really cared about environmental issues the way I did, you know, or I thought it was just me and like one of my friends, but, you know, here's a whole class of people that care in the way that I do, and I don't feel alone anymore. I feel like I'm part of a community, you know, and that, like, that on its own is worth so much. You know, something simple like just getting outside. I've tried to do this more this year, actually, you know, for various reasons, right? Teaching in the pandemic, but, you know, getting outside and just like, so again, in terms of joy, and just recognizing the, you know, the even in small ways, the beauty, you know, around us. I mean, and I know people teach in very different settings. We go outside and we have a major freeway right next to us. So it's not like it's, you know, necessarily an ideal scenario, but, you know, you can still look in small ways, for things that can kind of ground us, you know, in the moment. You know, so I think that can be part of our practice, you know, on a daily basis or semi regular basis. It can help. I mentioned an assignment called Imagining 2040 that I've been doing the last few years with the environmental justice class. And, you know, and partly this is inspired by braiding sweetgrass, and, you know, which is a resource that I have later on in the slideshow if people aren't familiar with it. But a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer that I think is really important at the beginning of that. She writes that as the land becomes impoverished, so too does the scope. And she's talking about her students here, of their vision. I realized that they could not even imagine what beneficial relations between their species and others might look like. How can we begin to move toward ecological and cultural sustainability if we cannot even imagine what the path feels like? If we can't imagine the generosity of geese? These students were not raised on the story of Sky Woman, which is a reference to the first chapter in the book. But, you know, I kind of feel like this has become one of the biggest responsibilities that I have, especially as a social studies teacher teaching about the climate crisis in the era that we're living in. I used to feel like part of my job was helping students to see that there was an issue worth caring about, you know, 10, 15 years ago. You know, bringing in stories of the effects of the climate crisis around the world. That's not part of my job anymore. You know, students are breathing in wildfire smoke in the summer. You know, they're living through the heat dome of last summer. You know, I mean, the climate crisis is here. It's, you know, announcing itself with increased ferocity every year, right? And so in some ways now, I feel like my job has shifted to helping students to see that there's a world worth fighting for, and that there are people out there doing that work, and wanting them to be able to see themselves in that work. You know, and so this work of imagination, imagining the future, I think, is really probably one of the most important things that we can be doing with climate education.
Yeah, I love that.
I don't know if you want me to pause for a second there, maybe.
No, I think it's because there's so much focus and discussion around how to be helping everyone, but youth in particular, manage climate anxiety and the issues that are coming up. And I think this framing that you just have around that there's a world worth fighting for, and here's how you do it. Like, it's just a very engaged, responsive kind of support or response for that. And I just kind of want, so I'm really struck by that frame, and then the very tactical ways that you're doing that through these different activities. So I'm just resonating and vibing with you, actually.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this activity, this know what we're fighting for activity, it's just like one of the most beautiful things that I feel like I get the chance to witness, over the course of the school year. Because again, and here's, in terms of a multidisciplinary approach, I don't limit this to writing. I actively encourage students to make art. I had one student that wrote a recipe for this, which was just incredible this year, and all the different ingredients and kind of the process of, of cooking up the sort of future that he was imagining. And so like coming in and sharing those, it's so joyful, it's so hopeful, and it's utopian in the best sense of the word, because we need that. We need as much of that as we can get. There are so many dystopian versions of the future out there for all of us, especially our students, to consume. And that's what they come to us with now. Try it for folks that haven't. But just like ask students cold what their vision of the future looks like, and it's pretty dark. And so they really need, they need some encouragement. They need some help to kind of see all these other possibilities, the future's not written, right? These are just as possible as the dystopian ones. It's just we don't see them that often. They don't show up for us. So yeah, pretty important.
I was just re-listening to a podcast episode with Donna Haraway and Anna Singh, who do a lot of work understanding just how society works in damaged landscapes and finds their way forward. And Donna Haraway, when asked the question about, well, do you have hope for the future? She's like, well, no, I have heart, actually. Like, we need to understand the thick present that we live in that's led us to this moment of complex circumstance, but then figure out what's the partial recuperation or response that will move us towards kind of a more just and thriving, future. And so I hear I was listening to that yesterday, and it was resonating as you're kind of opening up your image of the work as well. I wondered if we could reach for that next layer of complexity around, what if there's pushback around activism of this sort, or this kind of mobilizing of youth in particular directions?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question to address, because I think it's so situational, and so it's, on the one hand, I recognize that I have been operating, in a very supportive and encouraging environment, right? Here we have this climate justice policy that, where it's the policy of Portland Public Schools to encourage student activism, right? So that's sort of my context. And so I recognize that people are teaching and operating in very different circumstances and contexts. I think what I would say, having talked to educators in different parts, of our states, of the country, is that that there are students everywhere who who are pushing for a more hopeful, a more just future, who don't accept the notion that that we have to we just have to live with a future of climate crisis, right? And I mean, you know, you can, or of social injustice for that matter, right? So I mean, look for example at the examples of activism over the last few years, whether it's the youth climate strikes and all the communities that those are happening in across the country, and maybe even more significantly, the Black Lives Matter protests that happened, you know, in virtually every single community across the country, right? And so, you know, and those are often being driven by young people. So, you know, this is what they are demanding of us as adults. And I think that it is easy for, you know, for adults to, this is not the sort of the political compass that they're coming with. This is not the vision of the future, you know, that they want being taught in classrooms, to come in and call this indoctrination. And you know, and I get that. I get that, you know, why someone might come at it from that direction. But I think if we're really being responsible and accountable to our students, you know, we have to come to them with the kind of hopeful, joyful, responsive curriculum, you know, that this moment really calls for. So I guess that's how I would try to approach that question.
Appreciate that, and the situational nature of it that you're highlighting. We have a kind of a following question from Hannah in the chat around whether or not the class where you can kind of open this work up, is it an elective or is it a required class, and does that make a difference in terms of like how you navigate the space?
Right. You know, I think that, I mean, that is an important question. And I think that, you know, in Portland Public Schools, we have kind of struggled with that when we think about what it means to provide climate education, you know, across the entire school system. So, you know, my class is an elective. As a result of student advocacy, there are now climate justice elective classes in almost all the high schools across the district, but they're all electives, you know. And so, you know, the trick then, I think, is to make sure that really bold, responsive, justice-oriented climate education is making its way in across the curriculum. And that, you know, we have school policy that calls for that, but it you know, getting there has been a 6-year process that is really very much still unfolding, you know. And so I think that it's probably even more important that you know, some aspects of the work that I'm sharing and talking about today can start to show up in required classes, not just in elective classes.
And sort of related to that, you touched a little bit on some of these policies or reforms that are needed to support students and teachers. Things like funding or school district reforms, collaboration, you mentioned a lot. Thinking about what regional support you'd also feel most meaningful, like any other comments related to those types of supports?
Yeah, well, I mean, I have to think about the climb time, you know, regional support that you invited me to participate in Southwest Washington, Deb. But I think that's such a great example of like finding teachers, you know, making space for teachers regionally to find one another, you know, maybe across buildings, you know, and to find the time. I really think that like one of the biggest, like most important, you know, I was going to use the word gift, but it shouldn't be a gift because it should just be part of like what teaching is about, you know, but allowing teachers to find one another and come together to share their expertise, you know, the concerns that they have around teaching the climate crisis, because there are a lot of concerns, you know, and it's like psychologically challenging. And so I think just being able to share and collaborate and like, you know, nurture one another in that activity is just like invaluable, you know, and it's something that I'm hungry for that you know, we need, quite honestly, we need more of here in, you know, in our area. And I think that what you all have been doing in Washington is a real model for that.
Thank you for that. And I noticed that our collaborator in Washington State, one of them, many ones, Ellen Ebert, is also on the call today. So a big shout out to the state for all the work that they've been doing. All right, we have about 10 more minutes to just sort of finish out.
So if the people in the audience know us. We love to share resources and build them. So we wanted to open up the question for you. And I know you've prepped some things you wanted to put on the table. So if you could just maybe do some resource sharing, and we'll move towards wrapping up. If there are any last minute questions, people can throw them into Q&A and we'll try to squeeze them in. So, but back to you for resources.
Cool. Yeah, I did. I really wanted to make sure to share with, again, a nod to Washington. The host of this podcast, Grace Lynch, is from the Seattle area, and there's some wonderful episodes about Washington. But this is just one of my absolutely favorite resources that I've run across recently, because I feel like it really encapsulates a lot of what I've tried to talk about. And so I just recently wrote a short piece for the most recent edition of Rethink Schools about this podcast, As She Rises. But it does everything that that I want in my classes when my students are encountering the climate crisis. It has art in the form of poetry, some really beautiful poetry at the beginning of each podcast, and then there are these deep, rich stories of community activism that follow in the particular communities that are featured across the United States. People, struggling in these communities against the different forces of the climate crisis that they're encountering. But importantly, most of the time, I guess this one I'm thinking about in the Skagit River Valley has a win. And I was just going to say how important it is for students to see activists winning as well, because, so often that can feel disempowering to not see that. But it's just such a beautiful combination of activism and art. And my students have responded really, really nicely to listening to this. A couple of other people who've been really influential for my students this year: Leah Pettiman, African-American farmer out of New York, who is one of the just most brilliant, incredible, joyful people that I have been able to introduce my students to. Anything that she has done on YouTube, the writings that she's done, I would just encourage you to find a way to bring it into your life, to bring it into the lives of your students. And I think more people are maybe familiar with Robin Wall Kimmer and Braiding Sweetgrass. Also has been an incredible resource. It's something we've read aloud in environmental justice this year, and that has been a really wonderful thing to do. In terms of the Imagining the Future assignment, a little bit older resource that I also wrote up for Rethink Schools are these Message for the Future films. And so I would encourage folks to check those out. That can be really, really useful. Couple of things kind of in terms of just like complicating the history of environmentalism that I included in here too, about the racist history of the environmental movement, and also kind of moving away from individual solutions. Those are a couple of important pieces there. And then finally, just to finish with another nod towards the Teach Climate Justice campaign at the Zen Education Project, where so much of the community that I have had a chance to work with, be inspired by, collaborate with, where we have been able to store and resource a lot of the work that folks have done around this. So that's a handful that I would share.
That's awesome. So we will work as quickly as we can to get the recording for this webinar posted to the playlist I just dropped in chat. And so you can find a gather of the resources that Tim was just sharing and others that have come up today in the show notes for that. Tim, while we have you, I have to ask about a People's Curriculum for the Earth, next edition. What can you tell us about what's coming in the revision?
Well, we're on a hopeful timeline of about a year at this point. So we'll other collaborators might hopefully that's okay. So we'll do our best with that. And and I mean, we're trying to, one of the things we've worked on these last few weeks or last few months is an activity that really kind of tries to story all of these different pieces of the really kind of this movement, like what we've called, for lack of a better term, the movement toward a Green New Deal, or towards a just transition, right? And so, what are the voices? So, kind of the intersectional nature of the climate crisis. How do we bring together housing justice, racial justice, land back, tribal sovereignty, food justice, and like how are all of those people kind of working at the intersections of what it takes to address the climate crisis holistically. So that's an activity that we're excited to kind of finalize and get out.
So appreciate that as a resource. It's traveled so well in the years, and I knew it took a while to come together originally, and so I appreciate the care that you're taking to get the next edition out. Well, thank you so much. We want to thank everyone for joining us today. We especially want to thank Tim Swinehart for sharing all that amazing work. I know there was more that you wanted to share that people will be able to learn a bit about through the slide set that we'll post, but thank you so much, Tim.
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. Thank you very much for being here. I always enjoy our time. Like I learn something new every time we get a chance to share space together. So thank you for that. A recording of this discussion will be posted on the climate learning section of the stemteachingtools.org website. Resources and papers will be linked in the notes for the video. So, and we will check in with Tim, but we'll try and post all of the different resources and thoughts that were provided here as ongoing resources.
And we also want to thank Corey Shee, who's working behind the scenes to make this go seamlessly. So thank you, Corey. Please join us next month on June 10th from 11 to noon Pacific, when Dr. Alexis Patterson-Williams and Dr. Selena Gray will be joining us. They will be sharing their justice-centered framework for science teaching called Holistic Science Pedagogy, and how they've been using that in a climate unit over time to engage youth in justice-centered work. So very much well aligned to NGSS and science ed sorts of implementation standards. So that's just kind of a really great justice-centered image of what that work can look like. So we have presenters mapped out through the summer. So second Fridays in this time and location, we'll just keep it going. So Tim, thank you so much. Appreciate you making time this week amidst everything going on.
And thanks for all the love in the chat for Tim and for all the time that you're giving us today. So thank you.